I thought you were dead.
My death was greatly exaggerated.
Ah!
What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and as I love reminding people, for a hot minute here at the start of Orks of Omen, post their enormous nerfs in the most recent data slate update, Tyranids were the worst army in Warhammer 40k, Space Marine chapters notwithstanding. And then while they've slowly crept up from that lowly position, now being at the dizzying, lofty heights of only the second worst faction by win rate, they still found it within themselves to win a GT this past weekend. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome back to 40k Tournament Tech Talk, today tackling Tyranids.
Oh, Roger, what alliteration.
And we're going to be talking about the Salt Classic GT that was just won by Mark Parker and his Tyranids. I don't feel like I should need to say it, but this channel has a dramatic Tyranid bias. That's why we're going to be covering this event in particular. But going 5-0 with Tyranids, a faction that, while its win rate isn't the greatest, is also having a little bit of trouble getting to the X&1 or undefeated bracket at an event is pretty impressive at this stage. Whether or not Tyranid builds solidify themselves in the future, and we see the faction rise up from the ashes of their ignominy, I don't know, but right now it's looking a little bit tough for them. That said, I do think we're in a bit of a golden age for Warhammer 40k, and even armies with a relatively low play rate or win rate can still compete at the upper echelons of competitive play. So the stats have shown that every faction is capable of winning 5+ round events, and that is... As always in these Tournament Tech Talk videos, I'm going to be talking about the event in particular, some details about the event and rules that were used, as well as covering the list that won it and the matchups that it played. Now, fortunately for us, the Salty Classic GT recorded all the missions that were used at the event, so we get to talk about them in context of the missions, which I think in some cases is pretty important. So let's dive into it, and as always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, please drop a like in the video, subscribe in the channel. Do all that YouTube stuff, you know the drill at this point. And let's get into it. Now, the Salted Classic GT itself, like I said before, is a 44-player, 5-round GT in Plantation, Florida. It had some cool stuff going on for the event, including a team trophy award for teams of at least 3 players that averaged together those players' scores and gave a trophy to the highest placing team. I think that's pretty sweet. Gives you something else to fight for, even if you've lost a game in the GT proper and are no longer in the running for the top prizes. In addition, it used the US Open layout format. Those are these big rectangular bricks of terrain on the table with line of sight blocking walls on top of them. Now, the event packet was very particular. The walls were treated as true line of sight blocking in most cases. Either they had lots of windows and were relatively open, in which case were just treated as true line of sight blocking full stop, or they were a little bit more intricate and only the first couple levels were treated as true line of sight blocking. This means that larger monsters and bigger models have a lot of places to hide, whether it's behind the actual obscuring base of the terrain feature, so it blocks line of sight mechanically, or it blocks your actual line of sight if you're hiding behind the wall. Now, this has some pretty important implications for the style of list that Mark was playing this weekend. This list actually used a lot of units that were nerfed pretty heavily in the Orks of Omen update, so I think it's interesting to see them back on the table. It used a High Fleet Leviathan Orks of Omen detachment, using the High Fleet Leviathan adaptive ability, giving the army a floating hit reroll. So each time a unit goes to shoot or fight, it gets to reroll one of its missed attacks. The Leviathan's up action ability also gives it a transhuman effect on all of its Synapse creatures. However, its Synapse infantry will not get that. The list is headlined by a pair of Hive Tyrants, each of them with an upgraded ranged weapon. One of them with Shard Gullet and the Alien Cunning Warlord trait, giving him objective secured and counting as 5 models for holding central objectives. The other one with the Relic Stranglethorn Cannon, the Balethorn Cannon, which fires a high volume of Strength 9 3 damage shots, giving it a similarly impressive damage output. This one's running Adaptive Biology for a 5+ damage ignore, letting it play kind of aggressively and still be pretty resilient to incoming attacks. Interestingly, that's it for characters in the list. We're not running any Neurothropes, no other support characters. It's just the 2 Hive Tyrants standing in the middle of the table against all odds. We also have an interesting smorgasbord of troops, including 10 Gargoyles, 10 Hormigons, and 10 Termagants. Each one of these units is crucially different in subtle different ways, and they each perform a slightly different role within the Hive fleet. Gargoyles are fast and good at performing actions, and can also defend the Hive Tyrants in some instances using Blinding Venom. The Hormigons are even faster, with the ability to automatically move 6 inches on an advance for 1 CP, and to get the ability to advance and charge, meaning that they can fight for enemy chaff infantry over objectives. And Termagants are mostly good screens. They're a little bit tougher to kill, and can mostly sit in the back and do actions and normal utility stuff. They're the cheapest of the lot, so they're mostly there to do cheap unit things. In the elite slot, we have a little bit of a surprise 3 Zoanthropes. These guys got a massive points increase in Arks of Omen, going up 20 points per model to an enormous 70 points per each one of these infantry. They do a bunch of damage in the psychic phase, but most importantly, they do give access to their Synaptic Imperative, and that's probably what we're gonna be taking them for in this list. We also have 5 Tyrant Guard. That's important to protect the 2 Hive Tyrants. And 5 Tyrant Guard is a big brick of a unit itself. That unit is extremely difficult to kill, especially if it's hiding in cover, given that those Tyrant Guard have a base 2+ armor save, can get an invulnerable save from the Zoanthropes, and a 5+ damage ignore from the Catalyst psychic power, making them very difficult to kill, especially since they can never be wounded on 2s thanks to that Leviathan sub-faction ability. We then also have a mass of monsters. 4 Carnifexes with enhanced senses and heavy venom cannons, as well as a couple of additional upgrades, most likely to fill points, alongside 2 Harpies, both of them with the Stranglethorn cannons. Unfortunately, their more damaging venom cannon variety also got nerfed in the changed Arks of Omen, and they went up dramatically in their points value. One of these has been upgraded with Synaptic Enhancement to make it a Synapse creature, giving it that permanent transhuman effect, and also allowing it to broadcast Synaptic Imperatives, potentially to the other Harpy if they deep strike together. Now, these saw a bunch of other structural changes in Arks of Omen, the most important one being that the Harpies have to begin the game in strategic reserve, being aircraft. This means that you don't get to attack with them on the first turn, but you can hold your army for a round 2 beta strike. Because of the US Open terrain layout and the army's relatively small footprint, being composed mostly of characters and Carnifexes, you can basically hide the entire thing, or at least make it unshootable thanks to Look Out Sir on those Hive Tyrants for the first 1 to 2 turns of the game. So if your opponent has a lot of ranged attacks themselves, you're going to be trading shots with them with the Hive Tyrants, but as long as you have a position for your big Tyrant Guard unit to hide, there's no opportunity to shoot back at them. You do need to have something closer to the enemy than the Hive Tyrants are, but the benefit of that US Open layout is that oftentimes you'll have a position where you can put a Tyrant Guard in the front corner of one of the US Open buildings, then put the Hive Tyrants just a little bit behind that so that the Tyrant Guard unit is closer to your opponent and granting that Lookouts are to the Hive Tyrants. That lets the Hive Tyrants shoot with impunity and potentially cast psychic powers and really just annoy your opponent for a while. Then, once your opponent has moved out to try to deal with them, you can use the Zoanthrope Imperative, give the entire army a 4+ invulnerable save, and break cover with all the Carnifexes. At that point, it's probably round 2, and you can drop the Harpies in at the same time and really just threat overload your opponent with a mass number of monsters, all of which are protected by an incredibly strong invulnerable save. Not many armies can shoot through the massive amount of -1 damage, 4+ invul, -1 to hit beef that you're giving them, and so oftentimes you're going to get basically 2 rounds of shooting once you're protected by that Zoanthrope Imperative. You'll get 1 round of shooting when you break cover, pop the Imperative, they'll shoot back at you, hopefully you absorb most of their damage on that invulnerable save, and then you get to shoot back at them. All of these Carnifexes have heavy venom cannons, so the list in total is firing a grand total of 12 Strength 9 AP3 4 damage shots, with 4 floating rerolls and the ability to get reroll 1s from the Hive Tyrants themselves. The Hive Tyrants themselves are putting out 3 5 damage shots from Shard Gullet and D3+3 3 damage shots from the Balethorn Cannon, and then each of those Harpies is putting out another 2d3+6 2 damage shots.
Oh, that's a lot of damage!
Not to mention the fact that the 2 Hive Tyrants are throwing out psychic powers. The Zoanthropes himself can do a lot of damage with mortal wounds as well, and getting into a shooting match with this army is oftentimes a pretty bad idea. In the late game, the Hive Tyrants can melee pretty well, and the Tyrant Guard, with additional attacks from Sidling Talons, additional attacks from being next to the Hive Tyrants themselves, and potential rerolls from the Hive Tyrants, actually punch pretty good, especially in a universe where there's no Armor of Contempt, so they're AP1 or AP4 on their small or big attacks, respectively, actually works at punching Space Marine bodies and a lot of other medium weight units pretty well. Overall, it's a very interesting list, kind of a straightforward gun line, but can really bully the mid-table with those two Hive Tyrants and the Harpies jumping in behind them. If your opponent doesn't have the beef to deal with the Harpies, they'll just continue to print value over the course of the game, fly over, shoot your opponent off their objectives, and really disrupt things for them. So with that, that is the winning list broken down. Let's talk about the exact opponents that it played on its way to the top tables. This is a pretty classic aggressive Goth Orc Horde list, running 2 kill rigs, a bunch of commandos, and a bunch of heavy and medium infantry to dump into those transports and run into the middle of the table, declare a Wa turn 2, and charge your entire army. This was on Secure Missing Artifacts, which is a pretty high scoring mission, which certainly helps the Tyranids, given that the Orcs are already almost guaranteed a high score thanks to their aggression and really strong secondary objectives. That said, the Orc matchup can often come down to going first or going second, and if the Orcs lose that roll-off, you're going to be able to potentially lock them in their deployment zone with fast-moving units like Gargoyles or Hormagaunts, shoot their kill rigs to death, and prevent them from getting a good Wa on turn 1, and maybe even turn 2. If you can feed your little units into them while you shoot them with Harpies and endless amounts of Venom Cannon shots, you can whittle the Orc army down to the point that the Carnifexes and Hive Tyrants can finish it off in the late game. The lack of objective secured in the Tyranid list is a little bit dangerous for it. Orcs do have pretty long threat ranges, but the fact that the entire Tyranid army operates in every phase lets them clear off a lot of Orcs pretty quickly. So if they're able to get the ranged alpha on the Orc army, I don't really foresee an issue with being able to chew through this. It really oftentimes comes down to that roll to go first with Orcs, unfortunately. Round 2 is against Carlos Mendieda's Farsight Enclaves. Now, this was on Recover the Relics, which is one of the most defensively oriented missions in the game. And I think, unfortunately, for the Farsight Enclaves, actually gives the Tyranids a brace of really strong secondaries that they can pick. Because you have 3 objectives in your deployment zone, the Tyranid player can fall back on secondaries like Raise the Banners High, whereas normally in more aggressive missions, Tyranids don't really have as strong secondaries. This one was a little bit of a blowout. Mark was able to score a 97-50 victory, and that 97 speaks to me that he was maybe playing some Warp Ritual, and was able to get a 15 on all of his other secondaries while getting his 12 on Warp Ritual. With the 2 Hive Tyrants pumping the Tyrant Guard full of defensive effects, it can be difficult for Tau armies, especially if they lose one or more of their ranged units early, to deal with that big brick quickly enough for the Hive Tyrants to not whittle them down. And if the Hive Tyrants are sitting in the middle of the table, especially against an enemy that doesn't have any psychic denial, they can be performing that Warp Ritual very reliably. This is also an interesting Tau list in that it had 3 units of stealth battlesuits, most likely to screen out any enemy deep strikers. And while these don't work particularly well against Tyranids, given that Tyranids themselves don't have any turn 1 deep strikes, it could be problematic for them if they forward deploy too hard and can allow the Tyranids to get to grips with them. That gives the Tyranids a little bit of a springboard to get units to Tau objectives and disrupt their own scoring, and can give the Tyranid army a little bit of a leg up. The army didn't have any exemplar of the Kauyon, so there was no redeploy available to it, so there wasn't the opportunity to place the stealth battlesuits far forward. Use them aggressively if you win the roll to go first, and if you lose the roll to go first, pull them back to their deployment zone. That combined with a very defensive mission for Tyranids, I think made it a little bit difficult for Tau, especially since a Tyranid list like Mark's can actually trade shot for shot with a lot of Tau once they actually move out into the open. Round 3 was against Astra Militarum run by Joshu Prévert. This was on Conversion, and this one made me do a double take. Imperial Guard are one of the armies that I have marked as a very difficult matchup for Tyranids, and I was surprised when I saw that this was a relatively big blowout for Mark, 83-59. That's a normal Tyranid score. Tyranids are very good at scoring between 80 and 90 points, generally speaking, on a win because their secondary objectives aren't super high, but the same is not true for Astra Militarum, who have some incredibly strong secondaries and score very easily. They also have a lot of really powerful ranged attacks that are good at ignoring the defensive attributes that Tyranids try to provide, including things like the Finial of the Nemmerdesh First, which ignores -1 damage, -1 to hit, damage ignore effects that Tyranid units like Carnifexes are relying on. That said, the Finial only affects platoon units and doesn't actually work on heavy armor. And that's the interesting thing about this particular Imperial Guard list, given that it is running Armored Superiority and Swift as the Wind, not the normal build of Born Soldiers. I think this list may be constructed in anticipation of a nerf to the Kazarkin combo. I've talked about this combo at length in previous videos, and I may continue to talk about it until it sees a little bit of a change. If you're using Born Soldiers and apply a bunch of stratagems and rerolls to a Kazarkin unit, they can do a ridiculous number of mortal wounds spread out a lot of enemy units. That's a perfect ability to deal with units like Carnifexes, because on average they'll almost kill 2 to 3 Carnifexes with one of those souped up Khazarkin squads, and there's not really any counterplay that the Tyranid player can do, especially since they're losing their infantry to units like mortar teams so quickly, and they're forced to screen aggressively, which just walks units into the waiting guns of the Astra Militarum. That said, this list is not using Born Soldiers, so it doesn't actually have that combo active, but it is still running Khazarkin, who, to be fair, are a perfectly fine unit at 100 points. You can still just play them and point rerolls at them, and they're good to go. And I think that's what this list is doing. It has a ton of Leman Russ battle tanks, including 5 normal Leman Russ in the heavy support slot, as well as a tank commander and a Chimera to hold one of the Khazarkin teams running mechanized infantry. Now, the downside of this army is that reliance on heavy armor, and it may just be that it's an army that's trying to get into a slugging match with an army like this Tyranid one. With no redeploy effects like the Barbicanski on the Khazarkin, there's no real danger besides the mortar teams shooting into gaunts that the Tyranid army has to deal with for the first couple turns of the game, so they can force the Imperial Guard players' hands to move their Leman Russ battle tanks forward and actually take objectives, especially since the Hive Tyrants can pick away at any forward operators that the Imperial Guard army is using, like these 2 Scout Sentinels that we see in the fast attack slot, and require those big battle tanks to come forward. As soon as they do, the combination I talked about earlier happens. That 4+ invulnerable save gets popped, all of the Carnifexes pop out, unleash hell onto whichever poor hapless Leman Russ is standing in the front, and then hope to be able to weather the swing back. And if they can, then they're looking pretty good. Especially with weapons like the Balethorn Cannon and Shard Gullet, they can really tune up Leman Russ battle tanks, and the mass Venom Cannons in the backline also helps as well. So I'm actually not that surprised that Tyranids were able to deal with this style of Leman Russ army. That was a huge win for Mark, catapulting him into the semifinals where he played Tim Pinney's World Eaters. This is another matchup very similar to Orks, where your opponent has excellent secondaries and plays incredibly aggressively, but one thing that his opponent may not have contended with is the mission he was playing in. One of the benefits that World Eaters have is Lord Invocatus and his warlord trait, Road of 8 Bloody Steps, which allows him to pre-game move several core units before the game begins. The US Open layout does have some forward positioned ruins, or just ruins that are slightly out of your deployment zone, that you can use to springboard yourself from the safety of their line of sight blocking walls into the midboard or even your opponent's deployment zone, depending on your speed. And units like World Eaters 8-bound are excellent at doing that. The downside is that in Abandoned Sanctuaries, the mission that we played today, no pre-game moves can move you out of your own deployment zone. So we might as well just cross that warlord trait right off Invocatus' datasheet. He basically doesn't have it. And one of the biggest reasons to play non-Angron World Eaters is just axed by the mission. That was clearly a huge deal in this matchup because Mark was able to take this down in a ridiculously close 80-79 game. With the mass number of 8-bound and Chaos Rhinos that are going to be relatively stuck in their own deployment zone and are perfect profiles for heavy Venom Cannons to deal with, I can see that these World Eaters would have been running across the table and getting gunned down. The downside is that the Tyranid presence in the midboard isn't quite as good as World Eaters, which is probably why the score is so close, but I imagine that the Tyranids are way better at attritioning down that World Eaters army and winning in the late game, which is another playstyle that Abandoned Sanctuaries can favor pretty well. And that moves us on to the finals game. This was against the current scourge of the metagame, Space Marines, but it's only Iron Hands, no Dark Angels today. And this was against Andrew Zoidas's Iron Hands. This was on Tide of Conviction, a very swingy mission that, depending on whether you're going first or whether you're going second, can dictate entirely your game plan. In my experience, especially playing Tyranids, going second is usually a little bit favored, given that your opponent is forced to come into you, and then you can clear them off and win in the late game, where you can potentially score a 21-point bottom of round 5. And especially given that this Iron Hands list doesn't have any drop pod Devastator squads, you're not particularly punished if you go second. It is relatively bricky with big tanks and a huge unit of Terminators running up the table at you or potentially teleporting in. But those are all profiles that, again, those heavy Venom Cannons are excellent at dealing with. Especially the fact that their 4 damage is very funny against Terminators, who are kind of relying on the 6+ damage ignore granted to them for being Iron Hands to survive 3 damage attacks. But those Venom Cannons are 4 damage, so it's actually incredibly difficult to survive. And basically every converted Venom Cannon shot is 1 dead Terminator. The primary damage dealer in any Iron Hands army is the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought, running 2 twin Volkite Culverins. However, these are low AP, usually only AP 1, and 2 damage attacks, meaning that shooting into Carnifexes, it's actually a little bit tough to get around their defensive profile. You're wounding on 5s, they're saving on 3s probably, and then you're -1 damage anyway. So you're relying on a glut of mortal wounds to try to chew through that defensive stat line, but if you don't get them, the Carnifex doesn't die, and then he gets to shoot your friends and eventually open up that Relic Contemptor to be shot and killed later in the game. This was a pretty big blowout, 82-46 in favor of the Tyranids, and made Mark the undisputed winner, 5-0 of the Salty Classic GT. Huge congratulations to Mark for taking this one down, and it's awesome to see Tyranids continue to compete in the Arks of Omen season. Well, I definitely meme a lot that their win rate's relatively low. I definitely don't think Tyranids are unplayable or terrible by any stretch of the imagination. Like I said at the top of the video, I think even factions that are not doing well statistically still have a pretty good chance to win, and I think that especially factions like Tyranids do have a lot of interesting builds still available to them that, in the hands of the correct player, can do pretty well. I think what's most interesting about this list is that it kind of looks like a pre-nerf list. It's running Harpies, it's running the Hive Tyrants and the Carnifexes that you saw before those units got nerfed, and it's just using them with impunity. Doesn't really care so much about the nerfs, it just wants to shoot you with venom cannons until you stop moving. Definitely inspired me to take another look at Leviathan myself. Leviathan's actually the highest performing Tyranid sub-faction right now, so I think that there may be still some juice left in that tank. Whereas a lot of people have moved to Gorgon or Behemoth, it may be that the old ways are still the best for the faction. And with that, that's all I have to say about this event. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Let me know down in the comments what you think about the state of Tyranids and the 40k meta in general. Do you think it's like cool that most factions can compete and win GTs right now, or are there factions that you wish could win more or less? Thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. I love you very much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming. Oh, you want to go home? Open the door.